difficult to make a moral argument in today's society without quantitative data behind it. And so I'd kind of like to know your experiences blending quantitative data with this overall qualitative argument about something as so controversial as taxes.
Well, it is certainly much easier to measure diminished economic growth quantitatively, than diminished moral prosperity, if you want to call it that. So the book relies a lot on moral reasoning. It does use some of the examples, like I talked about, with the people getting divorced every year so that they could cut their income tax and that sort of thing. There are some anecdotes in there to illustrate the principles, but it is a much more reason-based argument. It's if the tax code if an income tax discourages earning income, a marriage tax is going to discourage marriage. And if the tax code lets the government decide for you what you should do, it accustoms you to looking to the government for that kind of guidance. Or if not directly to the government, to your estate lawyer, your estate planner, your accountant, your tax lawyer or whoever, to find out, what's the best deal, where am I going to save the most taxes? When really, without those kinds of distortions or incentives, you might want to talk to your family, perhaps your pastor, your someone in religious authority, your friends, people you trust, people who know you, people who can give you guidance, people who know your situation and know what decisions can help you make the decisions that are best for you, not a government that doesn't know you, doesn't want to, and just wants to take your money and control, your eating decisions. And so those are the kinds of arguments that I make throughout the book, where when we tell people, government's putting an imprimatur on X type of behavior, we're telling everybody go out and engage in that behavior. Sometimes it's good behavior, buying a home. But it might not be what's best for them, and it keeps people from continually developing the skill of virtue, of making right decisions, of deciding again what's best for you, what's best for your family, of seeking counsel from people who know you rather than from people you have to pay to wade through a tax code that not only you can't understand, but the congressmen who write it can't understand. Does that answer your question?
Okay. I have one other question.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the works of Irwin Schiff?
I have not read Irwin Schiff.
Oh, okay
Then the question's not gonna. Okay.
I was just going to comment that another thing on the moral dimension, if you're constantly going to the tax lawyer, if you're going to the accountant and such, looking for loopholes, that it's basically you're going out of your way to try and be, in a sense, dishonest.
Well,
to exploit it. I mean, for a perfectly good reason, but still.
If you're cheating, yeah, that would be dishonest. If you're taking advantage of deductions and credits and what have you that have been built in there, that's not really dishonest. And frankly, as long as you believe you spend your money better than the government, I think you have an obligation to give the government as little of it as you can possibly get away with. But what it does, it certainly accustoms you, to think of the government as an enemy, as something that you've got to try to outwit or get around. And it's unfortunate that government itself has brought itself to that position. As I talked about in the very simple example that I gave, it's noble to protect people's rights. That's a good thing. And government and those who govern us ought to be people who we can respect and appreciate for doing that. But instead, we're
seems like the opposite.
Well, there was a Rasmussen poll not too long ago that found Congress, being a congressman, to be the least respected job in America. Barbara Boxer was probably just appalled by that. She worked so hard for that title.
I just have one last thing to say. It just troubles me somewhat that you can have an honest person out here working, build wealth, and by the time they die, like so many have in the past, die broke, but somebody else has to bury you. That's an issue for me. I did some research. A lot of people like boxing, in the day where people had to come and rescue them because they had paid their taxes and capital gains tax and all the rest on the rich. Now I'm talking about the rich now.
Mhm.
And it's really a travesty, you know, to earn income and then to have it all taken away from you to where you can't even bury yourself. That's the problem.
That is really a sad thing. We hear all about how we should have a living wage and so on, and certainly we want a society where everyone can work and support his family. But the things that are making it so hard for families to get by and to save is not primarily, some greedy boss who's somehow not paying them a fair wage. It's all the taxes that they have to pay. It's the regulations that make it so difficult for them to start a family business if they want to, or to have more opportunities at other businesses that someone else had started if they're not entrepreneurial themselves. Well, I mean, I could say it's getting out of hand, but that's, that would be an understatement.
It's heartbreaking.
That's all right. This young man here has one.
Yeah.
I have actually it's a two-part question. We talked about the proper role, what the government is supposed to do, and I agree that the government is doing too much. So first part of the question is, what do you believe the proper, actually looking policy to apply is what the proper role of the government is? And second is, how do we get back to that pragmatically, since we're so accustomed to the government providing so much for us?
Well, what government should be doing is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That's where the powers are clearly laid out. Now, if people think, well, that was written 200 years ago, there's more stuff that the government can and ought to do. Well, okay, make an argument. Our Constitution has an amendment process. If it gets through Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures, then okay, we will amend the Constitution. We've agreed as a matter of national priority to do that. And so we'll do it. If I don't like it, well, it's amended to the Constitution. I can argue against it, but it's the Constitution. That should be our guide. It always was, up until 150 years ago when we had a much smaller government. The idea of limited government, isn't simply, something that was sort of picked from a bunch of different possible alternatives. It's really the only kind of government that won't continually encroach, will continually build inappropriate levels of power. Now, in terms of how do we get back there practically, well, we have a long way to go, as I think we all know. I mean, that's part of why I wrote my book. I talk a lot about the importance of getting back to the Constitution in my book, and I talk about the things that have happened when we abandoned that standard. I mentioned earlier that the pattern of government expansion started with the ideas of progressivism that didn't really take root until the Depression, when people started to get scared and those ideas became more and more attractive. Well, I think the same dynamic can play out now if we get those ideas, the ideas of economic freedom, the ideas of constitutional government, more out in the public arena, to get people more used to them. I mean, how often, like I said before, Michelle Bachmann, but who else is talking about getting back to the Constitution? We need to talk about that. We need to get the ideas out there so that people understand them. They don't think, oh, it's some antiquated thing, the Constitution's over. It begins with the ideas. And then, then we move toward enacting public policy. As I mentioned, I am very, very encouraged by the Tea Parties, the 9/12 March, the response at the town halls. You remember those healthcare town halls were started for congressmen to come, Democratic congressmen to go into their districts and explain why we need healthcare reform. Well, what happened was that virtually every single one, conservatives came and said, we don't want this. The Pennsylvania lady who told our inspector, you've awakened the sleeping giant. She hadn't been politically active before. I've spoken at a couple of Tea Parties, heard from people saying, I was never active before, but this is just ridiculous. The response to the bailout. Dianne Feinstein said, she logged something like 8,000 or 9,000 calls, almost all of them against the bailout, and then of course she voted for it. But it's that kind of citizen activism. That's where it starts. And just like the founders of the country went through a lot of discouragements before they finally saw success. You know, if you ever get tired of soap operas or West Wing or anything, you know, read the constitutional debates. You know, that's some fascinating stuff going on. And it was, you know, it was hard to put together our government, but they did it. And frankly, they had the easy job. The hard job was being done by General Washington and the men who were fighting off this empire that the world had seen at that point. But they did it. It takes time. You know, it takes time for ideas to germinate. It takes time for people to understand how they work. It takes time for activism to pay off. But I'm very, very encouraged. I hope that my book plays a role. I hope that it helps inform a debate, and that, you know, I hope that we see in the next few years many, many more books and essays and other things on similar themes, you know, on the necessity of rolling back Leviathan, because this isn't working.
One behind you.
Oh. Yes, sir.
There are many things I liked about your book, but when someone asked about, you know, what you'd put on the chopping block first, you know, maybe you'd pick those damaging policy, but in terms of what would be the easiest thing to get some people to vote for, you know, maybe simple steps. I think the end of your book talks about some simple things that a person might not necessarily think of that would be little baby steps in the right direction. Would you feel comfortable sharing some of those?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the last chapter of the book, as I said, goes through the various tax plans that are out there, like the fair tax and so on. But then, recognizing that we're a long way from that, I put in some other suggestions, and I'm not going to bore you with all of them. But you know, for example, one thing I put in was an idea for a sunset clause. Now, we've seen that government can do sunset clauses when they're for tax cuts, which is why the Bush tax cuts are going to expire next year and why we're going to be in so much trouble. We can do that with tax increases. You know, it actually used to be the case. Very often taxes would go up when we had to fight a war. And there was written into the tax that this tax will expire, you know, either on a date or, you know, at such and such, you know, point, couple months, you know, after an armistice agreement is signed or hostilities end or whatever. That kind of thing, you know, we could still do. So, you know, for instance, suppose they put in these silly snack taxes. Put in a sunset to that so that when it doesn't work, when, you know, everybody doesn't magically have health care because of this, at least it's repealed. Then if we decide we want it back, then we can go through the process again. Make it hard to keep taxes high and make it easier to keep taxes low.
Leslie,
Now,
one thing. These town halls, I mean, usually they're boring. They never get as interesting as they did this year. One reason was, for the first time that I've seen, you had constituents who read the bill and congressmen who hadn't. But that's the internet. Could that be a real game changer here?
anything that promotes transparency, anything that gives us access to what government is doing is good. Why do you think the people working out the health care bill today are doing it behind closed doors? Because they don't want that. Yeah, I mean, anything that gets this legislation into our hands faster is a good thing. And yeah, congressmen aren't gonna read it. I mean, who was it Roland Burris who said, read the bill, I don't have time. I can't do that. That's your job, buddy. But it's also our job. We elect these people. We're responsible for the government that we have. Now, unfortunately, we can't read every bill. And that's one of the problems. It's very hard to be an appropriate watchdog of a government that's accountable to you if it's doing so much that it can't keep up with it. You can't keep up with it. But you can pick an issue. You can do something. You can read a bill. You can read a few bills. I called my congressman's office and asked if he read the stimulus bill before he voted for it. Well, first I got, hold on, please. And they transferred me to the poor LA who had to take the call. He told me, yes, he went through it. What does that mean? He went through it. He looked through it. Did he read it? Well, he looked through it. I get it. Thank you. As far as the internet, it definitely makes it easier, makes it more accessible. There is, I think, a danger in our 24/7 society to rush the process and push bills through. We saw this with virtually every economic bill that's happened in the last year, where they get read through where nobody has time to, they get passed through where nobody's had time to read it or talk about it. It doesn't really do you that much good to read the bill if you then don't have time to discuss it. If you, as a citizen, can't talk to your other citizens and say, hey, I'm not sure this is a good thing. If you can't go to your congressman and say, I don't think you should vote for this, for all these reasons. If your congressman can't talk to his colleagues and say, I'm not sure about this. So the internet, is not a panacea, and it's in fact part of changes that can be problematic. But certainly overall, anything that gets what these guys are up to closer to the people's hands is a good thing. Yeah.
I think my favorite town hall moment over the August recess was I was at Arlen Spector's town hall, and the lady was standing up, she was reading from the bill. Reads it, Spector responds, well, that's not in the bill. She goes, it's right here. That's like someone reading from a priest reading from the Bible, and some reads it, oh, that's not in the Bible. Jesus doesn't exist, so he wasn't, These people are crazy.
Good analogy. I don't know if Arlen Spector is crazy, but clearly the lady was doing her job, and apparently he wasn't doing his. Anybody else? Yeah.
I decided I did want to ask my own shift question.
Okay.
So, are you familiar with who he is at all? Then he dedicated his life to promoting this kind of what you're doing, the moral case for tax reform, but also the economic and legal cases for tax reform. And as a consequence of his books, all of his books were banned in the United States. You can only buy them in Canada. And he was put in jail he was given a trial, but he was not allowed to speak at his trial. And as far as I'm aware, there was no jury. He's been there for over a decade. And because in his books, he pointed out that there is no legal definition of the word income anywhere in the entire United States government. And yet, they're collecting this tax on something that the 16th Amendment states is voluntary, but they're treating it as an involuntary tax on something that they don't even have a definition for. Do you cover any of that in your book?
Well, the income tax is voluntary argument has never really gained any traction. My understanding of the history is that what the intention of that word was, it meant that you file it yourself. You self-report. It doesn't mean, instead of the government assessing what you owe and sending you a bill, you self-report your income and calculate your taxes. That's what voluntary was supposed to mean. As far as this gentleman being in jail for writing about that, I'm afraid I can't. Sorry?
I'm sorry, just habeas corpus on his case, on his part,
I'm afraid I don't know enough about it to comment on
Do you cover any
it.
of the legal inconsistencies with the tax code in your discussion of the moral inconsistencies?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, like I said, it traces basically the tax history of the U.S. and it goes through all the times that progressive taxes were overturned as unconstitutional, what we've gone and done in order to make it constitutional, and so on, and talks a lot about just how impossible it is now to even understand it. I put an example in there. Every year, Money Magazine has different accountants calculate a hypothetical family's taxes, and every year they all come up with a different answer because nobody understands what it means, and they debate with each other. Well, I think this provision means this. Well, I think it means that. And yeah, I mean, as you know, from the quote that Mal asked me to read from James Madison, incomprehensible law is tough to follow. Anybody?
One more thing.
Yeah.
Do you take on any of the arguments of Cass Sunstein? Because from what
I'm sorry?
do you take on any of Cass Sunstein's arguments? Because from what little I know of his work, he basically makes the opposite argument that you are, that government should use taxes and other policies to influence good behaviors.
You know, I certainly try to refute those kinds of ideas, you know, at a philosophical level, but I haven't gotten into a lot of, you know, responding to this person or that person. I'm trying to lay out my case and make a positive case, you know, rather than respond to, you know, whether it be Jim Moran or whoever, coming from a different perspective.